Did you know that nearly 40% of Americans under 30 have a positive view of socialism? And even more shocking, some surveys suggest that up to 10% of the world's population still lives under a communist regime. While communism might seem like a thing of the past, its ideas are far from gone. In fact, they're sneaking into modern politics, often disguised as something harmless. But here's the truth: communism doesn't always come with a red flag and a hammer and sickle. It can appear in your everyday conversations, in policies that promise equality, and even in social justice movements. In this video, we'll uncover how to spot a communist before it's too late. We'll dive into the subtle strategies they use to spread their ideas, whether it's through government control, cultural revolutions, or even hidden symbols. These aren't just political theories, they're real tactics that have shaped history and still influence the world today. Stick around, because by the end, you'll know exactly how to recognize the signs of a communist agenda, and how to protect yourself from it. Ready to see the truth? Let's dive in. Chapter 1: Red Flags in Disguise. When people think of communism, they often picture big speeches, revolutions, or people waving flags. But the truth is, communism can hide in plain sight. The first red flag is how the ideas are often presented as good, or for the people. For instance, discussions about wealth distribution or equality sound appealing to many. But these ideas can also be the first signs of a communist agenda in disguise. According to historian Paul Hollander, communism appeals to the idealist in all of us, promising equality and fairness. In practice, though, this leads to the consolidation of power in the hands of a few. A recent study by the Pew Research Center found that 43% of US millennials viewed socialism positively. The danger? Socialism is often a gateway to communism, where the state controls everything. Keep an eye on phrases like redistribution of wealth or equality for all. These might seem harmless, but they can be rallying cries for collectivism, a core communist value. Additionally, one of the most deceptive tactics is the focus on social justice movements that call for extreme changes. While social justice itself isn't inherently communist, certain ideas like the complete removal of private property or extreme government oversight may be masked as social justice initiatives. Remember, communists often mask their intentions in terms that sound like progress. A recent survey found that over 60% of young people in Western countries believe economic equality should be prioritized, a concept that could open the door to communist ideals if taken to the extreme. Chapter 2: The Marxist Playbook, Subversion Tactics. Communists are experts at subtlety and deception. In his book The Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx emphasized the need for class struggle, which in practical terms often means the undermining of traditional institutions. Marxists believe in infiltrating key parts of society, education, media, and government. By controlling these, they can shift public opinion. For example, in the early 20th century, the Soviet Union used its control of the press to shape narratives in favor of communism. Fast forward to today, and it's clear that media control is still a powerful tool in the communist playbook. A key tactic of communist movements is to create divisions between different groups, whether it's between rich and poor or workers and employers. This strategy of divide and conquer can be seen in modern-day political movements that encourage identity politics. By focusing on what divides people, communists can gain followers who believe that their group's rights have been oppressed. For example, when people are taught that certain classes or races are inherently privileged, it can foster resentment that distracts from the larger picture. Interestingly, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union spent millions of dollars infiltrating Western universities with pro-communist ideas. According to the National Security Archive, they funded students and activists who would later influence their peers with Marxist ideologies. This wasn't just a historical event, it's a practice that continues today. In modern universities, students often encounter Marxist theory in textbooks or lectures, sometimes without even realizing it. Today, we also see communist-influenced movements calling for things like universal basic income or government control over the economy. These may sound appealing but are often stepping stones toward complete state control, as seen in Venezuela and Cuba. In both countries, government policies began with fairness in mind but led to authoritarian regimes. Remember, communist movements often start with promises of equality and fairness but end with totalitarianism. Chapter 3: The Class Warfare Mindset. The concept of class warfare is a cornerstone of Marxist theory. It's the belief that the rich, or the bourgeoisie, exploit the poor, or the proletariat. The problem with this ideology? It ignores the potential for economic mobility and personal success. In Das Kapital, Marx argued that the working class would eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie, leading to a classless society. While this may sound idealistic, it's crucial to understand that communists believe this system can only be achieved through revolution. In fact, Lenin argued that violent revolution was the only way to achieve true communism, stating, "Revolution is impossible without a weapon of force." Today, many political movements, especially those focused on wealth inequality, mirror this Marxist framework. If you hear someone saying that the wealthy must be punished, or that capitalism is inherently evil, you're likely hearing a variant of class warfare. According to a Gallup poll from 2023, 53% of Americans agreed that income inequality is a serious problem, but it's important to differentiate between advocating for reasonable economic reforms and pushing for radical changes to the entire system. This mindset also plays into the rise of populist movements that challenge the elite. Populists often create a narrative that pits the average person against the establishment, labeling anyone in power as corrupt. This strategy may resonate with people who feel left behind, but it also has a dark side. When this rhetoric goes unchecked, it can quickly evolve into a demand for complete systemic overhaul, often calling for the removal of private ownership and market forces. The class warfare mindset also thrives on the idea that inequality is always a result of exploitation. While inequality is a real issue, communism ignores the reality that sometimes differences in wealth come from hard work, entrepreneurship, and innovation. For example, in capitalist economies, tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos rose to success by building companies that created millions of jobs. Communism, however, doesn't recognize these achievements as legitimate, only as products of exploitation. In the end, spotting a communist mindset isn't just about identifying catchphrases like redistribution or equality for all. It's about recognizing the underlying belief that class struggle is central to all societal problems. If you're constantly hearing about how the wealthy are to blame for all of society's ills, it's time to pay attention to the larger narrative being pushed. As Marx said, the history of all hitherto societies is the history of class struggles, and any ideology that continually emphasizes division might be leaning toward a more communist ideology. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned as we uncover more crucial strategies in the next chapters. Chapter 4: State Control. The new utopian dream communism thrives on the idea of a centralized, all-powerful state that controls every aspect of life. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels argued that the working class must seize control of the government to abolish private property and create equality. But what does that look like in practice? When a government begins taking control over major industries, it's usually a sign that communism might be lurking. For example, in communist regimes, industries like energy, healthcare, and even agriculture are controlled by the state. This concept isn't limited to historical regimes. Today, there are politicians advocating for policies that push for greater government involvement in daily life. Take the debate over healthcare in the United States. Proponents of universal healthcare often argue for a system where the government controls the distribution of medical services. While this may seem like a good idea to some, it's important to understand that government control over healthcare means more than just coverage. It can lead to state regulation of what treatments are available and who can access them. Historically, state-controlled economies have led to inefficiency and corruption. The Soviet Union, for instance, became infamous for its planned economy, which ultimately collapsed due to poor decision-making and lack of competition. A study from the Cato Institute revealed that the Soviet Union's economic growth stagnated because the government couldn't manage resources efficiently. Even today, countries with heavy government control over the economy, like Venezuela, are facing economic disasters. The lack of market forces leads to shortages, inflation, and poverty. When the government steps in to control everything, it's often a prelude to disaster. State control doesn't always look like overt nationalization. It can start with regulations that gradually limit private business. In 2020, the World Economic Forum published an article warning about the dangers of corporate socialism, where governments interfere with private companies to push their political agenda. Companies that might once be free to innovate or compete now face pressures to conform to government demands, whether it's on labor laws, environmental policies, or product offerings. So, be on the lookout for any talk of nationalizing industries or expanding government control into sectors where it hasn't existed before. Chapter 5: Cultural Revolution. History repeating? One of the most dangerous strategies communists use is a cultural revolution, a total overhaul of society's values. This is where communism goes beyond economics and into every part of life. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China, for example, sought to erase traditional values and replace them with communist ideology. During this period, the Chinese government encouraged young people to rebel against their elders and denounce anything that was seen as counter-revolutionary. As Mao famously said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend, only to silence those who didn't agree with his vision." The idea of a cultural revolution has been a key tool in communist movements for decades. What begins as a critique of tradition can quickly turn into a radical call for the destruction of culture. In the West, we see this in movements that aim to cancel or erase historical figures or events deemed problematic. While criticism of history can be important, when it goes too far, it becomes an attempt to rewrite the past. For instance, the removal of statues and renaming of schools may seem innocent, but it's a method of erasing traditions and values that could conflict with communist ideals. In his book The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx, philosopher Alan Woods argues that the cultural transformation pushed by Marxist ideas was always about creating a new kind of human being, one who is loyal to the state and rejects traditional norms. Today, we see this in movements pushing for new norms, in everything from gender identity to family structures. These ideas may seem progressive, but they often follow a pattern seen in past communist regimes, replacing old beliefs with those that serve the state's control. Modern-day, woke, movements, focused on social justice and cultural re-education, can be seen as part of this larger strategy. While social justice issues are often rooted in genuine concern, the way some movements demand total ideological conformity mirrors the early days of communist revolutions. The push for censorship, especially on social media, has become another tool for suppressing opposing viewpoints, much like the "thought police" in Orwell's 1984. Chapter 6, The Communist Symbolism You Missed. If you're looking for obvious signs of communism, it's not just about policies or ideologies. Communism uses symbolism as a powerful tool to spread its message. The hammer and sickle, for example, became the symbol of the Soviet Union, representing the union of industrial workers and farmers. This symbol was not just about agriculture or industry, it was about rallying people behind a collective idea. Communist regimes often use symbols to unite people under one banner and blur the lines between individual rights and collective responsibility. In modern-day politics, you might notice that certain phrases and symbols, while not explicitly linked to communism, echo these same ideas. For example, the use of raised fists in protests, popularized during the civil rights movement, has been co-opted by some radical groups as a symbol of revolutionary struggle. While not all people who use this symbol are communists, it has been historically associated with revolutionary movements, including those with communist ideologies. Another key to spotting communist symbolism is through the language used in political movements. Terms like proletariat and bourgeoisie still make their way into political discourse. For example, the phrase corporate elite is often used to paint successful business owners as the enemies of the working class. These terms, directly lifted from Marxist theory, are used to create a divide between us and them, encouraging people to identify with the oppressed and rally against the so-called oppressors. A more subtle form of symbolism is in how policies and platforms are framed. The idea of workers' rights is commonly used by communists to create solidarity among laborers. Today, many progressive movements use this same language to push for increased government control of business and labor. While workers' rights are important, it's essential to question whether the ultimate goal is genuine reform or something more aligned with Marxist thought. Finally, pay attention to the growing presence of socialist and communist parties in various countries. While they may not always openly call for a revolution, many of these groups adopt similar tactics to the ones seen in earlier communist revolutions. In Latin America, leaders like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales used symbols of socialism and revolution to gain popular support, promising an overthrow of the capitalist elites. Even today, some of these movements continue to spread, often using populist language to call for the redistribution of wealth and power. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe for more insight into how these ideologies shape our world today. Understanding the symbols, language, and tactics of communism is key to protecting your freedoms. Stay informed.